having this discussion today as the United States is engaged in the biggest fight over voting rights and election law since the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Georgia recently became the first state to enact a sweeping change of its election law. The battle is also playing out on Capitol Hill, where Democrats are pushing their own counter, and in dozens of other state houses around the country that are controlled by Republicans. This is all coming after Georgia and a handful of other states were flipped to the Democratic column in the presidential election in November, and after two new Democratic senators, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, won runoffs here in Georgia to give Democrats control of the Senate in Washington. And this all played out as former President Donald Trump asserted false claims that his loss was due to widespread voter fraud. The new law in Georgia has drawn immediate backlash. Corporate CEOs from locally based Delta and Coca-Cola have called the law unacceptable. Voting rights groups, including one founded by Ms. Abrams, have sued in federal court. And Major League Baseball moved its All-Star game from the Atlanta Braves home stadium to Denver. Governor Brian Kemp, who prevailed over Ms. Abrams in the 2018 governor's race here in Georgia, has defended the law, saying that it fits his now well-used motto that he wants to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Ms. Abrams and other critics counter that this law is simply a new version dusting off voter suppression tactics of the Jim Crow segregation era last century. Ms. Abrams, with that setting, can you explain to people who haven't necessarily gotten past the headlines or who have seen the most pitched rhetoric, what you mean when you say this law will make it, if it stays on the books, will make it harder for Georgians to vote, particularly Black and other minority Georgians that have been historically marginalized?
Well, first of all, Bill, thank you for that very important backdrop. And I want to add one other piece to this, and that is the legacy of Jim Crow is often mischaracterized as being this blatant assertion that everything said that Black people could not and white people could. With voting rights in particular, the 15th Amendment precluded, in fact, prohibited any laws regarding voting from having an express racial bias. And so what was done under the Mississippi Plan, which eventually became part of the Jim Crow South legacy, was this notion that you could target people based on their behavior, knowing that that behavior was endemic to a specific population. And so in Georgia and across the South, laws that said that you had to pass a literacy test, that you had to pay a poll tax, that moved polling places, these were not things that were explicitly done to Black people. They were universal laws that applied to everyone, but there was a clause put in place called the Grandfather Clause. And it said if your grandfather would have been eligible to vote during the Civil War or before it, then you were exempt from these laws. Well, since African Americans were enslaved during that period, explicitly, the law did not use race, but implicitly it applied to African Americans. That's how Jim Crow worked. It did not say Black people can't. It had the effect of causing Black people to not be able to. And so when you fast forward to the laws we are looking at today, we have to look at them in context. Georgia has some, or had prior to March 25th, laws that permitted communities of color to participate widely in elections. We had access to early voting. We had access to absentee ballots. We had access to participation through line. If you're in a long line, people could help you stay in an 8-hour line by giving you food and water, because most people don't come to vote expecting to be there during the entire day. They don't bring sack lunches with them. Those are just a few of the challenges. None of those things are explicitly targeted at African Americans, but implicitly, based on the behavior that we saw in the 2018 election and the 2020 election, there's been increased use of these provisions of early voting, in-person absentee voting, use of drop boxes. And these are all of the things that have been tightened. The change of signature verification to using an ID to submit your absentee ballot is a direct result to lawsuits that we filed that allowed more people to use absentee balloting. And therefore, for the first time, communities of color as part of the Democratic Party outperformed Republicans who were largely white in the provision of absentee ballots. That had not happened. It happened in 2018 and in 2020. But prior to then, it had been almost always Republicans who won. And so that's a very long explanation for a very short and pithy answer, which is these are laws that respond to an increase in voting by people of color by constricting, removing, or otherwise harming their ability to access these perquisites. And instead, it's going to make it harder for these specific communities to vote. It doesn't say brown and black people don't vote. It simply says we're going to remove things that we saw you use to your benefit, or we're going to make it harder for you to access these opportunities.
Governor Kemp has been very assertive since he has signed this legislation, and he's keen on provisions like, the explicit codifying weekend early voting times, and setting aside money so that cost is not a barrier to the state ID that you referenced for absentee voting, and a handful of other provisions. Are any of those taken in isolation good provisions, even though we know where you stand on the law as a whole and its effects as a whole?
So let's take both of those. The first one, the notion that because of the codification of the permission of weekend voting and the constriction of hours to business hours. Here's the problem. This is actually going to make it harder in communities that are largely of color. They have long had the ability to use these hours. But if you're in a county that is predominantly white, that has an increasing community of color population, this now gives them permission to shorten your early voting time. Instead of it being 7 to 7, it now can only be 9. It can be 9 to 5, and the county has to decide to give you more power. Prior to this, it was assumed that everyone could vote from 7 to 7. If you look at the weekend voting, it actually does not help 60 counties that are largely communities of color. They've long been able to do so. This actually benefits white, predominantly white, largely Republican counties. That's a native good. It's important that more people can vote, and I'm not objecting to that, but I do object to a characterization that suggests that they have given something that did not exist. What they've done is actually placed restrictions for those who live in counties they don't see as beneficial to them. And when it comes to free ID, the notion of it being free is actually a misnomer. You may not have to pay a fee to actually get the ID issued to you, but you've got to pay for the birth certificate. You've got to pay for all of the documentation that leads up to being able to get that ID. And there is a cost, especially to rural communities that often do not have transportation or access to the DMVs, which are not on every street corner. They don't have access to a lot of the opportunities to get the papers they need. And so there's a very real cost to voters to secure this ID. Now, it's about 200,000 Georgians, but that matters because the more restrictive you make the process, the harder you make it for people to access their fundamental franchise and their right to vote as citizens in the United States.
All considerations, of course, of disenfranchisement as you're breaking those issues down. Thank you again for joining us, Ms. Abrams. Do you support the consumer boycott going on right now and corporate actions like those from the MLB moving their all-star game?
So I'm going to say what I have said since 2019, and apparently nuance is difficult for the Republicans to understand, but it's, I think, one of the only ways to operate in a free society. We have to allow for people to have nuance in their behavior and nuance in their argument. What I have said is this. I understand boycotts. I support the notion of boycotts as a macro good. I grew up in the Deep South. Boycotts are the reason that I have the ability to make this argument as a free citizen. And so, yes, I understand the impulse of boycotting, but I also understand that boycotts operate differently depending on your targets and depending on your timeline. I do not believe that a boycott at this moment is beneficial to the victims of these bills. I have said that before and I've said it again, but I do believe it is absolutely necessary for corporations to show their goodwill if they want voters, if they want their employees, their consumers, and their shareholders to trust their values. And that is that they have to publicly denounce these bills. They have to support and invest in voting rights expansion, and they need to support the federal voting rights standards that are embedded in H.R. 1, S1, and H.R. 4.
And you brought up a little bit about growing up in the Deep South and the Southern Black Belt. Your family, including your sister, Janine, they have long viewed voting as a sacred civil duty. You were very outspoken about that. Can you talk a little bit about how voting is rooted in your faith, your United Methodist faith, and just growing up with a strong, obviously religious background from both your parents being clergy?
When I was growing up, my mom was a librarian and my dad was a shipyard worker. They both became United Methodist ministers when I was 15. Although we tease them, they've always been preaching at us. They just made it official when they went to divinity school. But I also grew up with parents who had deep religious beliefs and also deep beliefs in the practice of our faith. And our faith says that when you see someone who's marginalized or disadvantaged, your responsibility is to intercede. They also raised us with a very fundamental belief that voting is a sacred obligation because it is the way that in the secular world we shape the world we live in. My father was arrested at the age of 14 for helping to register Black people in Mississippi who were denied the right to vote under Jim Crow. We tease him that my mother did the same thing. She was just, better at it and didn't get caught. But I grew up in a family that not only believed in our faith as a religious identity, they believed in our faith as a responsibility to be a lived experience. And so for me, defending the right to vote is not just about defending it for people of color. My push is that we should have expansion of the right to vote for every community that faces barriers, including the disabled, those who are returning citizens, the poor, young people. Unfortunately, the targets tend to be those very same communities. And thus, most of the work that I do is about lifting up their voices and protecting their right to vote.
Seems really traumatic what you brought up about your father. Is that your earliest memory of voter suppression? Is that what you can recall as the earliest time you've seen that disenfranchisement?
Well, so my dad was 14 when he was arrested. I wasn't there, but
thank you for clarifying.
No problem. But I remember the stories. I tell a story of my grandmother when she first had the right to vote in 1968. My grandmother was afraid to vote because she remembered the dogs and the hoses. And for those who think of this as sort of a bygone era, my grandmother passed away in 2019, which means that for most of my life, I had me. But for most of her life, she lived under the auspices of Jim Crow. My grandfather fought in World War II and the Korean War. And each time he returned to the United States, he was denied his citizenship because he lived in the state of Mississippi. I take this to be fundamentally necessary because it is how we secure all the other rights to which we are entitled.
Ms. Abrams, going to a just practical bottom line, President Biden won Georgia by a little more than 12,000 votes out of almost 5 million cast. The Senate runoffs were wider than that, but still extremely competitive and within that margin of a couple of 100,000 that you mentioned, talking about the IDs. Could Democrats have prevailed in those races under these rules if they were on the books in November and in January?
I think it is possible for Democrats to win in part because of the miasma of just wrong-headed behavior that we were seeing from Republicans, namely at the top of the ticket, and suborned by the 2 U.S. senators who were defeated. But having laws on the books should not be the measure of whether or not a party could win. The laws on the books should determine whether voters can participate. And that's the place where I think we get our rules mixed up. We start to focus so much on who's arguing for or against that we ignore the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are that we live in a nation where democracy undergirds our behavior. And yes, you'll have these, facile arguments about whether we are a democratic republic or a republic. We use democracy to make our choices. And my issue is that regardless of who is making the decision, it is wrong for any state to preclude access, especially under the guise and under the bald-faced lie that this is an expansion. There is nothing expansive about these laws. And to your earlier question, if you take them as separate pieces, the problem is that you cannot pull out that thread and still look at the fabric of our laws, because these laws do not happen in a vacuum. They occur and exist within the larger framework of bureaucracy, of existing laws, and of the practical challenges that Georgians face when it comes to exercising the right to vote. It was put into sharp relief in June of 2020 when people stood in line for 8 hours during a debacle, an absolute breakdown of the right to vote. People lost their wages, families lost opportunities simply to exercise a basic right. And so we cannot pretend that what preceded March 25th and SB 202, that those things do not exist, nor can we pretend that more cannot be done to harm them if we sanction this type of restrictive voting law in this moment.
You mentioned the Democratic bills pending in Washington. Shifting there, how important is it that those pass, and how much they wouldn't necessarily supersede everything in this Georgia law or in these other state laws, but how far could it go, in your view, legally to mitigating the negative effects that you see from the state actions?
It would be an extra forward because it would absolutely standardize not only for Georgia, but across the country, what's happening in Texas and Arizona and Pennsylvania, in Michigan. It would standardize the laws so that our democracy does not depend on our geography. One of the most discordant parts of American democracy is that the quality of your participation as a citizen changes when you cross state lines. That should not be countenanced by anyone. And it is absolutely within the purview and the perquisites of the Congress to say that we will have a standardized election system that guarantees automatic voter registration, in-person early voting, and no excuses mail-in balloting. Those three pieces alone absolutely create, I think, a playing field that more than anything creates a level opportunity for voters, regardless of race and regardless of geography, to participate in our elections.
Talking about SB 202, do you believe if you run for governor again, you could win in 2020 under those rules and how as they stand today?
I've not made any decisions about my standing for office, but again, I think we have to stop focusing on partisan issues. This is about the people of Georgia. Republicans are going to be harmed. In the state of Georgia, tens of thousands are going to now have to put their driver's licenses into may decide to have to put their information. If they don't have their driver's license, they may have to put their information into an envelope that is boldly marked as absentee ballot application, meaning that it is a clarion call to any person who wants to steal their identity. It is an issue for the disabled who may not have the kind of IDs and have not had to worry about it because they were able to use signature verification in order to submit their ballots. This is a wrong-headed decision and that hurts communities of color, that hurts communities of disadvantage, and that hurts people of every political stripe. And so we should not be thinking about these laws in the context of who can win an election, except to the extent that the Republicans are gaming the system because they're afraid of losing an election.
Going back to Washington, the filibuster obviously has gotten so much attention, President Biden's agenda as a whole, but certainly on this voting rights debate. The president has joined those who describe the history of the filibuster and its roots in opposing civil rights legislation in the 20th century. One, can you see Democrats passing any of the election laws, election proposals that you've referenced without overhauling the filibuster? And two, specific to the president, how does it strike you that he has said he agrees that it is a vestige of the Jim Crow era, but that he doesn't necessarily support completely scrapping the rule altogether?
Well, I'm disappointed by the recent op-ed by Senator Joe Manchin that says that he's not willing to entertain any changes to the filibuster. I do believe his good intention that we should be able to achieve bipartisan support of at least the voting rights protections that are embedded in S1 and HR 4. This is not unheard of. In fact, we know that the Voting Rights Act was renewed twice by Republican governors and by Republican presidents. Actually, I think it was 3 times. And bipartisanship should be the approach we take to voting rights because it applies to all of us. That said, I do believe that there is a legitimate argument to be made that carving out an exception to protect the fundamental right of democracy and participation in democracy is worthy of an exemption to the filibuster. I can understand the hesitation of completely scrapping it, including the hesitation expressed by the president, because the worry is that if you remove it completely, you no longer have any controls over what can happen. And despite its original grounding wasn't racist, although it was used by avowed Southern racists to block civil rights, the original intention was not grounded necessarily in abject racism. That said, I understand that someone who served in a leadership role in a legislative body, you want to use any tool you can to help forces and manage debate. But I believe that this is one debate that should not be waged. It should be a given that we protect access to the right to vote in the United States, and that we provide these very basic access points, making certain that everyone who gets registered can stay on the roll and not be subject to being purged simply for not returning a postcard. Two, that we have in-person early voting because we no longer have an agrarian economy that exists on the same schedule so that everyone can take off a Tuesday to go and vote. And three, that we absolutely need to allow for mail-in balloting. While the pandemic was the current challenge in 2020, we know that other challenges loom for us as Americans, and being able to mail in your ballot or drop it off in a drop box is an important addition to our democracy. Much as machines technology improved our democracy, we should continue to make advances to make it easier to vote, and that's what we should accomplish. And I think that the U.S. Senate should take that up.
Do you see any scenario under which 10 Republican votes are cast in favor of any of these proposals?
I think that it is unlikely, but as going back to Hillary's question earlier, I am a woman of faith. And so my approach is to pray for what I need, but work for what I think needs to be done.
You know, a short time ago, the president just announced his executive action on gun regulations. Do you support his approach, given the probable impossibility of getting 60 Senate votes on such legislation?
I do support his action. I also support the bill that was recently reintroduced by Pat Toomey, Chris Coons, and others, a bipartisan legislation to move forward protection and gun safety. Now, the reality is we need more. We need an aggressive legislative agenda that addresses gun safety. But I also know that for every person who has been murdered in the state of Georgia and across this country, that every step forward is progress, that every protection is important. And while I certainly want everything we should be entitled to, I am proud of every step forward that we are able to make.
Well, there is an assumption, although we won't assume, so we have to ask you, that you will run for governor again next year. Is there any time frame when you will make your decision public?
I am not thinking about that right now. My focus is on making certain that we have elections that we can have full participation in 2022. But at the same time, I'm also working through my organization, Fair Count, on ensuring that every person eligible for the vaccination can get it, especially in the underserved southwest rural area of Georgia. We're also doing work on COVID recovery through the Southern Economic Advancement Project to ensure that recovery actually includes fixing the public health infrastructure and the public benefits infrastructure that is so broken across the South.
One final question, going back to the immediate aftermath of the election in Georgia before this slate of Republican bills started moving through the assembly. You were sort of the toast of the Democratic Party, getting credit for flipping Georgia. And you've taken great pains to say that a lot of people put in work over a lot of time, but you started a long time ago through your organizations and through the party. What has it been like since then? We can assume you're getting a lot of calls from Democrats and activists on the left in other southern states with similar racial diversity, with other Sunbelt states across Arizona, Texas. What are you doing to help activists on the left, organizations like Fair Fight, your partner organizations, the state parties in other states, to try to help export this model that took so many years but came to fruition for you in Georgia in 2020?
Lauren Grow-Wargo, who served as my campaign manager, served as the executive director of the New Georgia Project when I launched it, who has been my consigliere and my ally and my partner in this work. We wrote an op-ed laying out the high-level tactics we believe are necessary. We are taking phone calls from folks from around the country, answering questions, providing information. I wrote a book about it called Our Time Is Now that really lays out a pathway to building progressive power in our country. And I'm going to continue to do that work because ultimately I believe progress can and should be made. And I believe that while Georgia is certainly sui generis in our structure and in what we were able to achieve in 2020 and 2021, I believe this can be replicated across the country if people of goodwill can harness the power of those who are too often left out of the conversation and can build the infrastructure to guide those voices towards the ballot box.
You say what state is next?
we're working with a number of states. So it depends on who does the work and how much. I mean, look, I think the other piece of it is the investment matters. And as you know, Bill, because you've watched me do this for many years, things got easier the more resources we had access to. And that's one of the reasons it took more than a decade. And it's going to take time for others to build those resources, build the capacity, and to unlearn the behaviors that we have seen for so long, fomented by voter suppression, but also by voter abandonment. And they come from the other party, but sometimes it comes from within. And we have to do the work. It's going to be a different pace depending
To a Black woman running for office.
I think we have seen progress, and certainly the election of Kamala Harris as our vice president, as both a Black and Indian woman, the changes we have seen happen in terms of people who are willing to stand for office. We're watching that happen right now in North Carolina. My belief is that we will continue to make progress, but we have to always be aware that we exist in a duality, that our progress does not diminish the racism and sexism that often attends our intentions and our ambitions. My responsibility is to constantly drive for more.
All right. Well, Ms. Abrams, thanks so much for joining us. We've giving us a lot of your time and hopping around a variety of topics. We look forward to doing it again between now and whenever you make that decision public that everyone seems to be waiting for. But in the meantime, again, thank you for joining us. This has been AP Newsmakers. I'm Bill Barrow in Atlanta with Hillary Powell in Washington. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you will join us again in the future.
Thank you so much.
Stand by.